Hi, welcome to the first lecture of week 2 of Philosophy 1500.02. I have a new microphone this week, so hopefully it works and it doesn't destroy your hearing. Anyway, there are 2 lectures this week. The plan for the first one, this one, is to talk about recognizing arguments. Right? And for our purposes in this lecture, that's going to be distinguishing arguments from things that aren't arguments. Right? So let's get started. Good. So we're going to start off with a quick review of what an argument is. Recall our definition of argument from last week. Right? An argument is a collection of statements, some of which are premises and which are claimed to support another of them. That is another one of the statements in the collection, and that we call the conclusion. Right, so remember that the premises are the things, something like evidence, right, that are given in support of what's supposed to be believed on the basis of the argument, namely the conclusion. Right, in the conclusion is the thing that's supported, right, by the premises, or claimed to be supported by the premises. Right, so one thing to keep in mind here, right, is that it's not always the case that the premises support the conclusion as stated. Right? Some arguments aren't good, right? And the premises don't actually support the conclusion. So for instance, it might be that the argument is invalid, right? Which we learned about last time and we'll talk about more this week. In that sort of case, right, the premises don't really support the conclusion, right? They're not good reasons to believe the conclusion because the premises could be true and the conclusion false. As we've been saying, arguments have this claimed connection between the premises and the conclusion. Right? That is, an argument is such that it claims that the premises support the conclusion. Right? So one thing that's important here, right, when we're going about trying to identify arguments is that we identify the premises and the conclusion when we do it. Right? So if we can find in some bit of prose, that is some bit of writing, something that looks like a conclusion and something that looks like a premise, right, or some premises, right, then that's evidence that we have an argument on our hands. Right. So to that end, it's important to note that in at least good writing, right, there's often some sort of indication, right, of when we have a premise or when we have some premises and when we have a conclusion. Right. And on this slide, we have a bunch of what we're going to call premise indicators and conclusion indicators. Right. So when you see these in writing, right, this is good evidence that you have either a premise or a conclusion, right? It's not probative. That is, you could see these words and it could just mislead you into thinking that you have a premise or that you have a conclusion. But this is some evidence. Right, so premise indicators are words like since, or because, or for, or as, or follows from, or is shown by, or inasmuch as, or is indicated by, or the reason is that, or may be inferred from, or may be derived from, or may be deduced from, or given that. Obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list, right? There are other ones. But when you see one of these, that's good evidence that you have a premise. We'll get better at recognizing premises and conclusions as we go through the lecture and look at some examples. But one thing to note here about some of the premise indicators, like may be inferred from, or may be derived from, or may be deduced from, is that they often pair with a premise or some premises and a conclusion. Right? So for instance, consider the following. It may be inferred from the fact that some people are nice, that there's at least one nice person. Right? So in this case, that some people are nice, or the fact that some people are nice is a premise, right? And that there's at least one nice person is the conclusion. Right? So what we have, right, is the may be inferred from picks out a premise, right, and then there's some sort of statement of fact, right, and then it's claimed that something follows from that. Okay. So moving on to conclusion indicators. Here's, again, a non-exhaustive list. Therefore, hence, so, accordingly, and consequently proves that as a result. Thus, for this reason, for these reasons, it follows that, I conclude that, which shows that, which means that, which entails that, which implies that, or we may infer. Okay. So let's think about the sort of examples of arguments that we've seen so far. right? I've put them in what I call premise-conclusion form, or what the book calls premise-conclusion form. That means that the premises are listed one after another, and then there's the conclusion. And I often use so or thus, right, or therefore, right? So, comma, whatever. Obviously, most of the arguments that we encounter in everyday life aren't laid out in premise-conclusion form, right? But using premise indicators and conclusion indicators, that'll give us some sort of sense of when we're dealing with premises and when we're dealing with conclusions. Again, it's not foolproof, right? It's not probative, but it gives us some indication. So before continuing on, I want to take a short break and ask sort of a rhetorical question. And here's the question. Why do we give arguments? Or to put it another way, what's the point of giving arguments? So I said that this is a rhetorical question, but that's not quite right. I think this is something we should be thinking about and reflecting on as we move forward in this course, not only this week, but the following weeks. So here's maybe one thing we can say for why we give arguments, or at least why I give arguments, right? Think about the sorts of people that you give arguments to, right? So you give them to other people, and sometimes you give them to yourself, or you're looking for an argument for why you should believe something. So the first thing, that we give arguments to other people, right? Or that we have arguments with one another, meaning not like shouting matches again, but that we give reasons for believing things, right? And we state that certain things give us reason to believe other things, right? Part of this is just so we can convince others, right? So that's at least one reason why we give arguments. And in this case, again, it's giving arguments to other people. But sometimes we give arguments to ourselves. We want to know why we should believe something, so we reflect on things that we know, right? And we find that, or we think that some things support some other statement, right? So we have some premises, we've got a conclusion. Why do we do that? That seems to be a much more difficult question to answer, right? So in the case of giving arguments to other people, right, I take it that part of the reason we do this is to convince people, to get people to see things our way, right? So perhaps we can get our own way, or do what we want to do, or just because it's enjoyable sometimes to give arguments to other people. But in our own case, it doesn't seem like that's what's going on, at least most of the time. So one thing I said is that we give arguments to ourselves, right, so that we have reasons to believe things. Right, so I think part of this is just tied up with being a rational person, or a sort of person who responds to reasons. Right, so the idea here is that we give arguments to ourselves, right, so that we are reflective, right, we have reasons to believe the things that we believe. All right, so if all that is correct, right, then this should give us some desiderata, or some things that we're looking for when we're trying to figure out what makes arguments good or bad. Right, so we want the premises to actually support the conclusion. Right, that's sort of the gold standard. And then we also want it to be the case that there's actually the desired connection between the premises and the conclusion. Right, we want them to actually support the conclusion. And one way that they can do that, right, at least in deductive logic, we'll talk about other sorts of logic as the course goes on, is if the argument's valid. Right, so this has sort of been rambling, right, but I've been circling around a few different points that I hope that I've made at this point. And the basic idea, right, is that given the sorts of things that we use arguments for, right, we have an interest in there being good arguments, right, and one way that they're good arguments is if they're valid. Okay, so taking another step back, right, if we want to figure out whether or not an argument's valid, right, what do we have to do? Well, an argument's valid just in case, or if and only if, it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. So that should be familiar by now. In fact, say it with me. An argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. Okay. So in order to figure out whether or not an argument's valid, right, we have to figure out what its premises are and what its conclusion is, right? But even before that, we have to figure out whether or not we actually have an argument on our hands, or if we're dealing with something that's a non-argument. All right. Right, so we've looked at some reasons why we're interested in arguments, right? But again, the sort of point of this lecture, right, is to figure out how we can recognize arguments. So there's no foolproof way, unfortunately. That is, there's no sort of instructions that you can follow from beginning to end, and you're guaranteed to figure out whether or not you have an argument or not. Instead, there are some heuristics, right? Some strategies that you can follow, right? And if you follow them and you're diligent about it, you might or probably will come up with the correct answer to whether or not you have an argument or not, right? But simply following them isn't going to guarantee that you've recognized an argument. But again, these are pretty good heuristics. So I think there are two that we need to keep in mind. So the first one I have here is ask. Are there premise and conclusion indicators? Again, these are words like since or because or it follows that for a conclusion. Go back a few slides and look at the list. Okay, so if you have some prose, that is some sentences or some statements, and some of them start with premise indicators and one of them starts with a conclusion indicator, then there's good reason to believe that you have an argument there, right? Or it's likely that we have an argument. Again, it's not foolproof, but it's quite likely, at least in normal writing and spoken language. All right. So the second thing you could do, right, and you might do the first thing and then this thing, or you might do them independently of one another. You might just do one. But here I have ask, does this passage claim to offer reasons to believe something on the basis of evidence it offers? Right? Another way to ask this is this a collection of statements, some of which claim to offer evidence for believing another, right? That is this a collection of statements, some of which are premises and one of which is a conclusion, right? So if you can answer yes to this question and you answer it, well, correctly, right, then you've got an argument. And if you answer no, right, and you're correct, then you don't, right? So these sorts of heuristics might be kind of foreign to you at this point, right? At least as they're stated here. But I think you're pretty familiar, or it's likely that you're pretty familiar with recognizing arguments, even if you don't think of what you're doing as recognizing arguments. So one thing that we'll do later in the lecture is we're going to look at some passages of prose, right? And one thing you could do when you encounter that is just ask yourself whether or not you're trying to be convinced of something, right? Is someone trying to convince you to believe something, right? If they are, right, and they give you some reasons and they claim that those reasons support something, right, then that's an argument, right? So this is somewhere between these two heuristics. But I take it that it's something that we're familiar with, right? You're all students. You've read academic writing. Good academic writing makes a claim, right? And it tries to support that claim on the basis of evidence or reasons, right? And then it claims that those reasons support that claim, right? So one thing to think about is that good academic writing is writing that offers arguments. Right, so the important thing to remember about non-arguments as we go forward, right, is that non-arguments don't have a stated connection of support between some statements and another, right? Non-arguments might be collections of statements, right, but there's no claim that some of the statements are evidence for another or that they support it, right? So it's not appropriate to say of non-arguments that they have premises or conclusions, right? Those are things that arguments have, but it might be the case, and it often is the case, that certain non-arguments in passages, right, as parts of passages, are premises or conclusions for arguments in like the larger passage. Right, so we'll see some examples of that here in a minute. Right, so what I want to do now is just give some examples of non-arguments and talk about why they're non-arguments. So what we should be doing here is asking ourselves, is it the case that what's written has some claims or some statements that offer or claim to offer support for some conclusion or some other statement. That is, do we have a collection of statements, some of which are premises and one of which is a conclusion? Right. So the first example of non-arguments are warnings. Right. So these are well, it's hard not to use the word warning, so I can use a synonym. These are like admonitions not to do something. Right. And sometimes there's like a reason given. Right. Or sometimes the reason is left implicit. Right. So, for instance, don't exceed the speed limit. This seems like a warning. You could imagine a police officer saying it, or your mother, right? Or mind the gap, right? So don't fall into the space between the subway platform and the subway, or the train and the train platform. Violators will be towed at own expense or owner's expense. I can't remember which one it is that you see in apartment parking lots or business parking lots. And hopefully you're not familiar with this warning. But what sort of ties these together, right, is that there's something like you're being told to do something or not to do something, right? And there's usually some sort of explicit or implicit statement of what would happen if you don't listen to it. Okay, so I say at the beginning of the slide, or at the top of the slide rather, that this is an example of a non-argument, but what makes it the case that it's a non-argument? Well, for one thing, each of these is only one statement, right? And remember that arguments, there are premises and conclusion, right? So sort of just by looking at these and thinking about the definition of argument, you could tell that these aren't arguments, right? But more to the point, right? Nothing in any of these is designated or implied to be or indicated to be a premise, and nothing is like indicated to be a conclusion. Right? These are just warnings, not arguments. One thing that I'm not crazy about in this book is that it gives a lot of distinctions. Sometimes these distinctions are helpful, and sometimes I think they are unnecessary. It might be the case that in the list of examples of non-arguments that we get in the book, that we have a lot of distinctions that are maybe not super helpful. Right? But what all of them have in common, rather, is that, well, they're not arguments. They're non-arguments. And again, what that means, right, is that nothing's been designated as a premise, right, and nothing has been claimed that there's some sort of connection between the premises and some other statement, which we call the conclusion. So another sort of non-argument is what the book calls advice, right? And you might think that this is sometimes kind of close to a warning, right? So suppose the following, it said, instead of mind the gap lest you fall inside the hole, or something like that. I'm unsure if that's not advice. Luckily, I'm not going to be asking you, like, consider this non-argument. Is it advice or a warning or something else? I think that's pointless. That doesn't help us learn anything. But just bear in mind that things that maybe you would call advice are examples of non-arguments. So here are some examples. Before you take this exam, make sure that you've studied all of the material. Right, so I'm offering you some advice, I guess. Right? Maybe one thing that's tricky about this is that there's some sort of maybe implied reason for why you should do something. Right, so presumably there's some sort of implication here that if you don't study all the material, you won't do well on the exam. Right, but that again is not an argument. Right, there's no claim that something supports some other statement. Right, or some things. Here's another one. If you want to avoid cavities, brush twice daily and floss once a day. Good advice, but not an argument. Right? One thing maybe worth mentioning about both of these is that there is some sort of connection between the part that comes before the comma and the part that comes after. Right? The sort of connection is left implicit here. Sometimes it's causal. Right, so if you want to avoid cavities, right, brush twice daily and floss once a day. There's some sort of implied causal connection between brushing twice a daily and flossing once a day, right? If you do that, you'll be caused not to have cavities, or it'll cause you to have fewer cavities, or something like that. In the first one, the connection is maybe causal as well, right? So if you've studied all of the material thoroughly, right, you'll do well on this exam, right? But note that in both cases, what I've given you is an if-then statement, right, which, as we'll see later, is not an argument. All right, so now we're getting to the most important things, I think, in this lecture, as far as examples of non-arguments are concerned. One thing I can't stress strongly enough, right, is that beliefs and opinions are not arguments, right? So here's the first one. I strongly believe that there should be national service. So national service is something like everyone spends a few years in the military or the National Reserve, or spends a few years, I don't know, working in inner cities or something. Suppose I make the claim there, right, that I strongly believe that there should be national service. That's not an argument, right? That's merely a statement of what I believe, or what I'm purporting to believe, right? And it might be the case that that statement could be used in an argument, right? But by itself, it's not an argument, right? So this is important, I think, because in sort of contemporary discourse, it seems to be the case, right, that people confuse statements of beliefs or opinions as arguments. Right, so that I strongly believe that there should be national service, suppose I believe that, that's not a reason for anything, right? I haven't given a reason for believing anything, right? I've merely reported what belief I have. Similarly, suppose I say, I don't like the direction the country is heading, right? This is a statement of a belief or an opinion again, right? But it's not an argument, right? There's no sort of connection between that and any other statement that I've asserted, right? That's just a statement of opinions or a belief, right? So the important thing to sort of bear in mind here is that all the examples I've been giving so far are sort of small, right? Often it's the case that statements of beliefs or opinions are going to be followed or preceded by other beliefs or opinions. So you could imagine putting these together. So suppose I say, I strongly believe that there should be national service. I don't like the direction the country is heading. Right, so putting those two things together, right, and to make sort of a long, well, not long paragraph, but a paragraph, right, that's still not an argument, right? Neither of the things that I've said, right, have I claimed that one supports the other, right, and that's what we need for an argument. Do you think that there's a way that we could put these together and possibly add something to make an argument? So that's something to think about. You could pause me here. Or not, you don't have to pause me. But in any case, it's something to think about. Just looking at it now, it's not clear to me exactly what we would add. At least it's not clear what we would add that would make this easily a good argument or something. Another important example of a non-argument would be a conditional statement, or as we'll sometimes call them in this class, an if-then statement, or simply just a conditional. Or another word we might use is a material conditional, but we'll get to that in a few weeks. What these have in common, right, is that they have the following form: if something, then something. Right, so here's an example. If Trump gets his way, then there will be a wall. Right, so we call the part that's attached to the if, right, in this case, Trump gets his way, we call that the antecedent. And the part that comes after the then, in this case, there will be a wall, the consequent. That's a little bit of vocabulary that isn't super important right now, but I will probably use it pretty freely. So keep it in mind. Maybe make a note of it right now. So again, the if part is the antecedent, antecedent, and the then part is the consequent, consequent, consequent. I hope I spelled both of those correctly. In any case. So, conditional statements, not arguments, right? So merely saying that if something is the case, then something else will be the case, right? There's no claim that the first thing is the case, right? And that's what we need for an argument. So, for instance, I asked last time, or on the last slide, right, whether or not there was something you could do to it to make an argument. And I suggested that there was nothing sort of obvious that you could do to it, just off the top of my head. But in this case, we have something we could do, and that's this. So here's an argument. If Trump gets his way, then there will be a wall. Trump will get his way, therefore there will be a wall. Okay, so let's sort of dissect this. So the first thing to ask, right, is whether or not there are premise or conclusion indicator words. So, are there? Well, look at the last sentence. The word therefore appears. That's a conclusion indicator word. I want to say that if then followed by reiteration of the antecedent, in this case, Trump will get his way, right? That would be a premise indicator, right? But we don't have to go that deep. All we should say right now, right, is that we have therefore. That's a conclusion indicator. That's at least some reason to think we have an argument. Okay, next thing we could ask is, suppose I assert this, right? Suppose I say to you in conversation, if Trump gets his way, then there will be a wall. And of course, Trump will get his way. He always does, or something like that. Again, I'm not saying I believe that, but suppose I said Trump will get his way because he always does, right? And then I conclude, or therefore, there will be a wall, right? In this sort of case, have I given you some evidence for some claim and then claimed that the evidence supports that claim? Or here's a simpler way to ask it. Have I given you some statements and then said that some statement follows from them or is supported by them or claimed that it's supported by them? Intuitively, yes, right? In fact, more than intuitively, I think obviously yes. Right, so I've said if Trump gets his way, then there will be a wall. Of course, Trump's going to get his way, he always does. Right, and then I say, like, and it follows from that, or so, or therefore, there will be a wall. Right, so that's very, very good reason to believe that we have an argument. In fact, that's just what it is for us to have an argument. All right, so that's our first example at actually looking at a big piece of prose and seeing if there's an argument there. This is still a pretty artificial example in the sense that, look, most arguments that you see in prose, at least not academic prose, are not like this, or most arguments that you encounter in like the wild and everyday life with talking with one another don't have this sort of stilted structure, right? The if-then followed by the antecedent and then therefore. But someone might say something like the following. Look, it seems to me that or it's obvious because Trump has said so, that if he gets his way, then there's going to be a wall. And if there's one thing that I know about Trump, it's that he always gets his way. So I think we should prepare ourselves for the fact that there's going to be a wall. So suppose someone said all of that to you, right? That seems like a much more plausible thing for someone to say to you in the sense that it's much more akin to the way that we normally speak, right? It's not as stilted, as I said earlier, as this. So if someone said something like that to you, then you've got an argument, right? And it's because it's basically the same argument as what we have here. And the final example of a type of non-argument I want to talk about, although you should, familiarize yourself with the different things that the book says about different non-arguments. Again, you don't have to know the names of all those things. I think that's pointless, but like become familiar with the concepts. The final one I want to talk about is explanations. Right, so these are statements or series of statements in which some things are said, right, and they elucidate or explain some other thing. Right, so again, it's hard to say what's going on here without using like the word explanation or a synonym, but that's the idea. So we'll look at some more examples later, and there are a bunch in the book that you should look at. If you have any questions about them, obviously, please reach out to me. But given that there's a finite amount of time to talk, I'm only going to talk about this one. So here's the example. Golf balls have a dimpled surface because the dimples reduce air drag, causing the ball to travel farther. Okay, so I have no idea if that's true. It doesn't matter. But what we've got here, we should ask, right, is this an argument? And of course, this is not a trick question, right? The slide is titled Examples of Non-Arguments, and I've told you that this is an explanation and that explanations are not arguments, right? So it follows from that this is not an argument. Actually, as an aside, note what I just did in the last few sentences. I gave you an argument for why this is not an argument. But in any case, back to the main thread. Let's ask ourselves this question at the bottom. Does this passage contain a statement that is claimed to be supported on the basis of other statements in the passage? So perhaps pause me and think about that. Okay, so maybe you didn't pause me, but if you did, the answer is obviously no, right? So there's no there's no statement here that's claimed to be supported on the basis of the other statements. Right, so we're told that golf balls have a dimpled surface, and why is that? Well, because it reduces air drag and it causes the ball to travel farther. Right, so there is some sort of connection between golf balls having a dimpled surface, right, and and they're traveling farther, right, and that's claimed here. But we're not being told that we should believe that golf balls have a dimpled surface, right, because dimples reduce air drag, causing the ball to travel farther. So this is a pretty slender distinction, right, between explanations and arguments, right? There's some sort of connection between what's being explained and what's doing the explaining, right? But the connection there is different than the connection between the premises and the conclusion. Right, so premises and conclusion, right, they offer support for believing something on the basis of other statements, right, whereas explanations, they appeal to some things and they claim that they explain something else, right? As an aside, if you continue on in philosophy, there are certain views in the philosophy of science, right, and about the nature of explanation, where explanations do end up being arguments, right, but for our purposes, we'll say that they're not. Again, this is perhaps somewhat artificial, and really to make sense of the view, you'd have to pack more into the statement of the explanation here than is packed in, right, so something like, you might say something like this: golf balls have a dimpled surface, and the reason that they have the dimpled surface is that if they have dimples, then that would reduce air drag, and the ball would travel farther, right? They have dimples, therefore the ball would travel farther, or something like that. It's not super important, but in any case, explanations for our purposes are not arguments. So those were all the examples of non-arguments I wanted to talk about in this lecture. Again, read the book, familiarize yourself. There are there are some exercises. That's the word I'm looking for. It's actually at the top of the PowerPoint slide. There are some exercises you can do. If you want a key, I can provide you with one. But in any case, what I want to do now is turn to some exercises, right, and show you what you should be able to do on the basis of the reading in the lecture and some practice that you might want to do in the book. So I want to ask about some passages, right? So for each passage, we'll ask, is the following an argument? Why or why not? Right, so importantly, in the answering the why or why not part, right, you need to appeal to the definition of an argument. So let's look at an example. So if public education fails to improve the quality of instruction in both primary and secondary schools, then it's likely that it will lose additional students to the private sector in the years ahead. Okay, so are there premise or conclusion indicator words? Well, maybe. Maybe if-then is a premise indicator word. But is there a conclusion indicator word? Well, no. So it's maybe somewhat likely that we're dealing with an argument, but probably not at this point. More to the point, what sort of statement is this? Well, it's an if-then statement or a conditional statement or a material conditional, right? And we've already determined that those aren't arguments, right? So is the following an argument? No, it's not, right? Why or why not? Well, it's not an argument because it's a conditional statement, and most importantly, right, we're not being told to believe anything on the basis of anything else, right? Or there's no stated connection between what would be premises and what would be a conclusion. Partly because there is no conclusion here, right? This is merely a conditional statement. All right, so here's another example, or exercise rather, sorry. So here's another exercise. Here's the example. It's strongly recommended that you have your house inspected for termite damage at the earliest possible opportunity. Right, so is that an argument? Why or why not? So pause me, please, and try to answer the question. All right, so I hope you paused me and I hope you tried to answer it. I ask you to pause me and try to answer things mostly so that you actually have experience doing these things, right? Merely listening to the melodious sound of my voice, merely listening to my voice talk through these things or listening to me talk through these things isn't going to help you, right? You need to actively participate. Okay, anyway, that kind of a downer of a remark aside, right, is the following an argument, why or why not? Well, it's not an argument, right? It's like a bit of advice, or maybe it's a warning. Again, sometimes it's not clear what that distinction is, but it doesn't matter. What's really important here is that we're not being told that we should believe something, or there's no sort of claim of support between one thing and some other things, right? We're just being told that you should do something. One thing to note here is that sometimes we're told to do something and there are reasons that are given, right? Perhaps we're told that if we don't do something, then something bad will happen, right? So if you don't study, then you'll fail the test. And I know that you're the sort of person who doesn't study, right? So it's very likely that you're going to fail the test. Suppose I say that to you in like a fit of anger or something. In that sort of case, have I given you an argument? Right, so I have, right? I've claimed that something follows from some other thing. So I had a conditional statement, right? If you don't study, you won't pass. And then I said something like, well, I know you're the sort of person who doesn't study, so you aren't going to study. And then I claimed, so you're going to fail, right? Or I said, so you're probably going to fail. So in that case, I've given you an argument, right? But it sure seems like there's something having to do with a warning or advice mixed in there, right? So the warning or the advice is something like, if you don't study, then you'll fail, right? So it's a conditional statement. So going back to an earlier point, right? Arguments are made up of non-arguments, right? Often, or sometimes at least, if-then statements, sometimes warnings or admonitions. But this is something to keep in mind. Right, so when you're looking at a bit of prose, right, maybe multiple sentences or multiple statements, and one part is like an if-then statement, it doesn't follow that you don't have an argument or that you do have an argument, right? You need to look at the whole thing, right? Look at the whole. All right, so here's another exercise for us. Again, I want to know whether or not something's an argument and then give an explanation for why or why not. So here's the example. Since the 1950s, a malady called whirling disease has invaded U.S. fishing streams, frequently attacking rainbow trout. A parasite deforms young fish, which often chase their tails before dying, hence the name. All right, so pause me, try to figure out why this is an argument or not, or sorry, whether it's an argument or not, and then say why or why not. All right, so no surprise, this isn't an argument, right? This is like an explanation for like the genesis of a name or why a name is the way that it is, right? So the first statement, since the 1950s, a malady called whirling disease has invaded U.S. fishing streams, frequently attacking rainbow trout. This is just a statement of fact, right? So assume it's a fact. I don't know if it's actually a fact. I'm not a fisherman or a marine biologist. I don't know who studies that sort of thing. Perhaps one of you study that sort of thing. But in any case, this is just a statement of fact, right, or a belief, right? So that by itself isn't an argument, right? What about the next sentence? Well, a parasite deforms young fish, which often chase their tails before dying, hence the name. Again, this just seems like a statement of fact, right? One thing to note here, though, is that we have hence, right? Which in our earlier slide where we had a table that had premise and conclusion indicator words, I believe hence appears there, right? So here's an example where hence doesn't function as a conclusion indicator, right? Rather, it plays some other role. In this case, it gives an explanation for why something is the way that it is, right? So in this case, we have this disease, whirling disease. I guess whirling is going about in circles, and then we're told that young fish get this parasite and it deforms them, and then they chase their tails, so they're going around in circles. So that's why it's called whirling disease. Right, so in my own explanation of this just now, or paraphrase of what's going on, I said so, right, which is also a conclusion indicator word. But again, in this case, it doesn't function as a conclusion indicator word, right? It functions in some other ways, sort of to say that here are some things, they explain this, right, rather than here are some things, they support this, right, and give you reason to believe that it's the case. Right, so as this lecture just hit the 41-minute mark, I'm hoping to wrap it up soon, and you're in luck, there's this slide and one other, and then we're done. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So again, is this an argument, why or why not? Here's the passage. Mortality rates for women undergoing early abortions where the procedure is legal appear to be as low or lower than the rates for normal childbirth. Consequently, any interest of the state in protecting the woman from an inherently hazardous procedure, except when it would be equally dangerous for her to forego it, has largely disappeared. Right, so pause me, try to answer the question, is this an argument, and then say why or why not. All right, so it turns out that this is an argument. So first, premise or conclusion indicator words. Well, there's a conclusion indicator word, consequently, right, and it comes before consequently any interest of the state in protecting the woman from an inherently hazardous procedure, except when it would be equally dangerous for her to forego it, has largely disappeared. Okay, so the consequently suggests that some things have come before, right, that are supposed to provide support for this claim. Okay, so what provides support for this claim? Well, it's the first sentence, right? Mortality rates for women undergoing early abortions where the procedure is legal, appears to be as low as or lower than the rates for normal childbirth. Right, so in this case, right, we have something that's supposed to follow from something else, right, and this first statement is clearly intended to support the conclusion, or rather the consequently part, which it turns out is the conclusion. Right, so because the mortality rates for women undergoing early abortions, et cetera, are as they are, right, it follows that, or consequently, or any interest of the state in protecting the woman from an inherently hazardous procedure, blah, 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 has largely disappeared. Right, so I hope it's clear at this point that this is an argument, right, and how it differs from the other things that we've looked at. All right, so moving on to the next. Here then is our final slide. Okay, so is the following an argument, why or why not? Here's the passage. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free people to work out their own destinies in their own way. Okay, pause me. You know the drill. Is this an argument, why or why not? Okay, so not an argument. Right? It's just two statements about what someone believes, right? There's no sort of claim that one supports the other, or in fact that they support anything at all, any statement rather. One thing to note, right, is that these beliefs might support your doing some sort of actions or foregoing some sort of actions, that is not performing some sorts of actions. But that sort of support, right, for what you ought to do is different than an argument, right, which has to do with what you ought to believe on the basis of other things. Okay, so anyway, that's the final example. I hope that the sound quality on this lecture was better than the last one, although some people claim not to have problems with the sound quality, so it could be your computer was the problem. Hopefully this all made sense. If it doesn't, of course, as always, please be in contact with me. Do the exercises in the book if you're interested. I can send you the key. But yeah, so yeah, thanks for listening.